Hello and welcome to yet another episode of Virtual Encounters. I'm Abhishek Mahajan. We have former England cricketer Mr. David Gower with us today in Virtual Encounters. He's one of England's all-time greats and the left-handed batsman with all the class and the grace, and he made batting look quite easier. Welcome, David Gower. Welcome to DD India. Pleasure having you, sir. First of all, how have you been doing?
Well, thank you very much indeed. Lovely introduction. Always makes you feel good to be remembered in those ways. And although the playing days are a long way distant, the connection with the game is still very strong. These have been tricky times, let's put it that way, for the last year and a half or so. But at least we have what is known as hope. So there's been a lot of good stuff going on, which one can watch from a distance. A little bit I've been involved with closer to. And of course, there's always that interest. There's always something in the game somewhere in the world, even in these rather changed circumstances. Anyway, we're fine. We are absolutely fine. Thank you.
Right, sir. We know sports persons are mentally very, very tough and very, very strong, and they know better than us how to deal with these kind of situations. But again, sir, did you see India-England series, T20Is and test matches before that? Where do you think England went wrong?
Well,
starting with test matches.
Okay. The usual rules, I'll tell you this for free. The usual rules are when you lose, quite often it's because the other side has played better.
Yeah.
And I respect that from way back. If you go back to my era, we had a side called the West Indies in the 80s, who were probably the strongest side ever to play test cricket, but that's an interesting debate for another time maybe. And if you come up against a side that's playing well, and a side that is probably better than you man for man, then you need a lot of skill and a lot of luck to come out on top. So I think England's problems in the Test series, after that very positive start, which was largely led by Joe Root, let's face it. I mean, Joe Root, if he's made runs this year, England have done all right. They won in Sri Lanka, they won that first Test match in Chennai, and they look good when Joe is making double hundreds. But I mean, again, it's such a facile thing to say, isn't it? Because when someone's making double hundreds, automatically the team is lifted. And I think the problems obviously started from the second Test match onwards. The difference in the end is a little bit of stuff in tosses, but of course the tosses weren't entirely determinate because England won some and still failed. But I think the difference was in the quality of spin bowling. And let's face it, whatever you say about the pitches, they were conducive to good spin bowling. And I think it's very straightforward that India had the better spinners. When you've got someone like Ravichandran Ashwin, who has been around for a good decade, is an absolute master of the art. And you've got Axar Patel coming in, I would say, at the perfect time. Because if you're going to make your debut in test matches with turning pitches, that was the perfect time to make your debut. But the two of them bowled beautifully. And then that's when, I mean, something that we will all tell you about, anyone who's played the game, whether it be this era, previous era, or anywhere in the last 150 years, will tell you that when confidence goes, then the game becomes so much harder. And England, I think, just got themselves into a sort of state of confusion about the way to operate. So credit to India because they used those conditions well. Credit to India because they, between the batsmen getting enough runs. I mean, for instance, that Rishabh Pant innings in Ahmedabad. I mean, was that extraordinary or was that extraordinary? When that game was almost even. I'm going to say almost even. And you have an innings like that in Washington Sundar, then that takes a game away from anyone. So those sorts of things are key when you look back at a series like that.
But you think it's happy signs for India? Like you mentioned, Rishabh Pant performing so well. Did you see that reverse sweep that he hit to Anderson? And then Washington Sundar, youngsters, Mohammad Siraj, they're doing so well against England and before that against Australia. You think youngsters doing well, Indians have a very bright future in Test cricket?
Yeah, I think in fact, the most important series out of the two was the one in Australia because given the start to that series, and that could have crippled many a team, and given the injuries, given the way that people had to come in, make debuts, score runs, take wickets, take catches, the whole thing, I thought that was the most extraordinary comeback for a long time. And you know what it's like with the Australians at home? They like to believe they are invincible. And they obviously aren't, which actually, the only piece of good news from the English point of view about that is that when England go there in a few months' time at the end of this winter, middle of this winter coming, then that gives them a template maybe to try and base their tactics on what India did just before. So I think that was the impressive performance. And as you say, players coming in, young players coming in, as it were, finally, there seems to be an acknowledgement that there is a depth of talent in India, a real depth of talent. And I think actually, ironically, for so many people from outside of India who look at IPL as something strange and wonderful and weird and Bollywood-like, I think IPL has done a lot to progress these younger players into the sphere of Test match cricket. And it's also worked for the English players. Those that have been allowed to enter IPL and do well, I think have come out with new skills, new confidence. I think in that sense, it's benefited two sides like that. But I think the youngsters coming through from India, when you play in front of big crowds, I mean, okay, I know for the last 12, 24 months, you forget the crowds for now, but when you've been playing in front of big crowds, you have that atmosphere, you have that pressure. And if nothing else, IPL, I mean, it teaches you a lot, but it teaches you how to play under that sort of pressure. And that's ideal because, that sort of pressure, although it's a very different sort of game, the pressure itself is very similar, I think, to the pressure of Test cricket. So you've got these young men who are oozing confidence and talent. They come in and it looks as though they've been playing Test cricket for years, not just making a debut. So I think that is a very healthy sign.
Right. David, you mentioned about the confidence that the Indian players carry now, especially the youngsters, be it Ishan Kishan or Suryakumar Yadav, who's playing his first game in international cricket. And you mentioned about the IPL. If IPL was not there, maybe, for example, he would have been intimidated by sheer presence of maybe Ben Stokes. But he has played him earlier. Do you think because of the IPL, it's making a lot of difference that they have faced these bowlers earlier also, maybe in IPL or other leagues?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in that. I think, as I say, the IPL itself gives these young players an opportunity. And you do two things. You rub shoulders in your own teams with some of the greats, and you play against some of the greats. Okay, it might only be 20 overs. The skills might be a little different to those required for the longer innings of, say, a Test match or the longer spells as a bowler in Test matches. But it is that same thing that you sort of learn by osmosis. You learn by being in the presence of better players. And in fact, amateur players.
And David, coming back to England again, they have a fairly good team in ODIs and T20Is. They are #1 ranked team in both the formats. But how do you see England's future in Test matches in terms of how do you see the bowlers post Anderson and Broad era? Are they, do they have very good players, bench strength? How do you see the domestic cricket in bowlers I'm talking about?
Well, yeah, the truth again is that when you have people of that caliber, it is almost impossible to just say we can replace them, as and when they go. I mean, Jimmy Anderson is becoming a freak because he's playing to an age where most people are, sitting on the sofa like the rest of us watching. And yet he's still performing, as we saw on this tour of India, he's still performing exceptionally well. And Stuart Broad, who is 3 or 4 years younger, has a lot of life left in his legs and his arms and his shoulders, and has a lot of skills. So these are, two of the leading wicket takers in the history of the game. These are very, very special bowlers. And the others who we would then, or England would then rely on to come through and take over, well, people like Chris Woakes has always been steady, but he has his ups and downs. The paceman, Mark Wood, you have to treat very carefully because of the injuries. Right, you've got a fellow called Jofra Archer, who is outstanding, but has this recurrent elbow problem, which is seeing him having a bit of a break as we speak. So that's the worry about someone like Jofra. Has he got the physicality to, for instance, bowl for England in all formats for the next 10 years? He's got so much talent, and when he is fit, he makes it look horribly easy. And I mean horribly in the sense that I wouldn't like to be the other end facing him at any stage, even if I was 20 years old. But you need to look after fitness. You need to look after the longevity of these players. So there are others coming through. Ollie Stone had a bit of a go in Sri Lanka, who is sharp, but again has had injury problems. So it's this seems to be the big thing. Somehow we have to breed not just talent, but talent with the attendant strength to actually be around for the next 5-10 years and learn the trade. So that again, just to make the point, that's why Jimmy Anderson is so extraordinary. Because whatever it is, I mean, the gods have blessed him with a physique that seems to last a long, long time. And that's why he keeps breaking records.
Yeah, certainly a legend and right. And like Mr. Alvin Kalicharan would have said, shared talent will not take you forward. How strong you are here, mentally, how strong you are, that decides how much you'll play the international cricket. But David, coming back to you, we want to talk about your journey. You started playing cricket in 1978. I wasn't even born. You played 117 test matches for England, 114 ODIs. You played 18 years of first class cricket and amassed over 26,339 to be precise in 448 first class matches. My question to you is, are you satisfied with your cricketing career?
I suppose actually, yeah, the standard answer is one is never satisfied,
Mm,
because there are two things. One is you always think of days where you could have done better,
mm,
and you kind of think, yeah, but you tend to worry about these things a little bit too late, because one of the things I always admitted to is human frailty, and this is the great thing about sport, I think anyway, is that we look at our heroes nowadays and always have done as if they're flawless, you know, as if they're going to produce it every time. And there are certain people who seem to produce it pretty much every time, who are extraordinary. And there were people in my generation who sort of found that secret of being able to, as it were, turn the switch on every time they walked out to bat. I mean, one good example for me was Graham Gooch, who was very much a contemporary, made the most of a long career. And he changed, actually. He managed to change over his years from being a flawed genius to a very reliable genius and made a lot of runs. I always had that human frailty. And so I look back at times where I felt I didn't necessarily produce my best, but overall, then actually, yes, I'm pretty happy, because you know I'm able to talk to people like you who are able to read the figures. They might have heard the stories, some of the good ones from on the field, one or two of the good ones from off the field, that sort of thing. And I can at least say that I had a successful time overall, some really good highs, and I treasure those highs. We all have lows, which you have to learn. You were talking earlier about the strength it takes mentally. So everything up here
yeah,
and the tough times really are tough, because when you lose that confidence, you lose that sort of sense of self-belief, then the game becomes 10 times harder. And I went through a few of those times. So that, you know, that gives you a bit of toughness underneath it all. But the highlights, you know, the highlights always stay with you, and the trophies and the things that you have around your house to remind you of the good times. And the fact that I've been able to stay close to the game since has also been invaluable. I mean, my time was spent between, I think, something like 6 years at the BBC, 20 years with Sky,
yeah,
a bit of stuff with Channel 9 down in Australia, various other bits and pieces. And to have that time watching the game, you know, for free, well, I'm sorry, I'm being paid for it.
yeah.
Have that experience, have that link maintained so strongly for so long, I think has been just wonderful. So yeah, I mean, overall, I'm a very grateful person for all
But
the
what has been
opportunities
but
it's
what has
given.
been more satisfying? You started commentating very early after retiring from cricket. What has been more satisfying, playing cricket or maybe analyzing the cricket?
Well, you set your standards for both, don't you? So the playing is the more satisfying because, in a sense, because I think you've got to say there are fewer people can reach the heights actually playing.
Mm,
Commentary, you know, the presentation side of it I enjoyed as well as the commentary, and I always used to try and set myself high standards. You know, there are. I think if you look at the greats, you know, if you I mean the greats as players, you always try and emulate them. You try and repeat their successes. You try and be as good as you can be to be as good as they were. In broadcasting, we had some fantastic people that were on air when I was growing up and playing. So, you know, the great men, the likes of Richie
yeah.
Bennett, Brian Johnson on the radio, John Arlott on the radio. I mean, there's a number of voices that were excellent. Some of the Aussies, you know, you know, all around the world, there were voices that understood the game of cricket. And I think the best was Benno. I think he was the man who pretty much got it right almost all the time, just picking the odd word, the right sentence, the right silence.
Yeah.
These were things that I think we all treasured in that era.
Hmm. You said playing cricket was more satisfying, although you shared your journey in commentating. But again, if I ask you your best moments in cricketing career, uh, I'm sure we will have a list of stories. But again, if I ask you to tell us two, three best moments, Maybe your debut, you played well for Leicestershire, and then you got an English cap, or maybe leading England to Ashes wins.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I'll try and run through a few for you very quickly. I mean, yes, your debut is always special. I was, what, 21 years old. Pakistan was the team we played against. First some ODIs, one of which I got 100 in. Then the first test match was at Birmingham. And there is that sort of surreal feeling because you're still a young man. You're still actually, the great thing about playing at 21 is that you're not really frightened. You're nervous, but not really frightened. You know, it's all a bit of a dream. It's all just exciting. And I got a few runs there, got a few runs that summer. And then, of course, it gets harder. When you settle into the role and you realize you've got a career to make and things will get tougher, then you have to play better. But the highlights were, you mentioned an Ashes win, winning the Ashes in '85, because that was my most successful summer as a player and as a captain in the Ashes. With all the history of the Ashes, that becomes very special. Okay. But the winter before that was as special. Coming to India in that on that tour of 1984-85, okay, which was one, should we say, with a few extra problems, quietly. The day we arrived, the morning we arrived in Delhi, and Mrs. Gandhi was shot dead by her own bodyguard. That was a traumatic way to start any tour. We had 2 weeks of national mourning in India, which we were allowed to escape to Sri Lanka to play a bit of cricket while we left India to do its mourning. But that was an absolute tragedy. And of course, it meant that for me as captain on that tour, we started with a very interesting political situation. We had our own Deputy High Commissioner, Percy Norris, in Bombay, as it was then, Mumbai now, who was also shot just before the first test match there. So we had all sorts of things thrown at us. And to come together as a team, and I've obviously seen cricket in India for 40 years now, and I know how tough it is to come to India and do well. So for us to come together and somehow win that series was a very, very special 4 months. And of course, going back into those days, it wasn't just a month and a half like tours are nowadays. It was 4 months all around India, with the politics, with the drama, with the cricket. Again, some of the greats again. Sunil Gavaskar opening the innings, Kapil Dev in the middle of the order there. This was. These are things you actually remember very, very clearly all these years down the line. That was as proud as winning the Ashes, I promise you.
And your bestest moment would be breaking Sir Geoffrey Boycott's record and becoming highest run scorer in Test matches.
Yeah, that was quite funny. I mean, the irony about that was that I'd been going so well on a tour of Australia, 1990-91. I'd play one of my best innings ever in Sydney, got 100 there. But then we had this Tiger Moth thing, which a lot of people remember and laugh at. But for some reason, at the crucial moment at the end of that tour of Australia, my form just disappeared. So I found myself with two problems. One, I was still short of Geoffrey's record when I had a great chance to have passed it on that tour. Secondly, because of my slight disagreement with Graham Gooch at the time, who was captain, I found myself with 18 months and no Test cricket. So I came back into the side against Pakistan in '92. First Test back was at Old Trafford, nice pitch, but got a good bowling attack. Fazim Akram, Dhakar Yunus, Akid Javid, Mushtaq. So I was as nervous then as I was at any other stage of my career, but came back in, got the 32, I think it was, I needed to just get past Geoffrey, who was commentating. So he was in the BBC box for that game. Okay. And I got out after lunch, which was silly, usual thing, usual mistakes that people ascribe to me. Got out after lunch. At tea time, BBC said, "Can you come upstairs and we'll have a chat about the new record and we'll try and get Geoffrey there." And Geoffrey went missing. Geoffrey kind of disappeared for the afternoon. But we managed to find him, or they managed to find him, and he was able to sit there in his England blazer, England tie, and I think through gritted teeth say, "Congratulations, well done." Because Geoffrey's always had a saying. He said to me 1,000 times in the last 40 years, "If we had your ability, i.e. my ability, your ability and my brain," he says, "we'd be one very, very good player." Yeah. I've always taken the option to stay as I am, thank you. Geoffrey was an extraordinary player in his own way, but a very different player. Yeah. So I think that sort of kind of grated with him, that all that blood, sweat and tears he gave for England, and he sort of saw me as someone being, he's always admired the talent. We've always had mutual respect for the talent, but he saw me as someone being a bit more should we say, casual with the game. But anyway, he had to concede the record. And of course, very soon after that, I had to concede it to someone else, and they had to concede it to someone else. Yeah, and now there's someone called Alistair Cook, who seems to have gone thousands of miles past it. Yeah, this is what happens in the game nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely. But again, what was the reason that you had so much time? And that's why they used to describe your shots as lazy elegance.
I'm afraid that I don't know. That's God-given. That's just natural talent. It's a bit of an illusion, isn't it? I mean, I know. I mean, we all say it. We say it when we're players. We say it as commentators. We say it as lovers of the game. If you see someone like, for instance, the great players at the moment, the great batsmen at the moment, who are Virat Kohli, are Kane Williamson, Steve Smith, Joe Root, just to name the four top players I think at the moment. They seem to have just that little bit more time, don't they? And it's because, I mean, technically it's because the movements are all done at the right moment. Psychologically, it's because they have that little extra confidence that great players have, that they don't panic, they don't sort of make movements they don't need to make. And so all that, when you have the rhythm, I mean, batting is about a rhythm, isn't it? So if the rhythm is spot on, and it's like classical music or any sort of music, if the rhythm is absolutely right, then the rest will follow. And if you've got the sort of talent that those players have, which is extraordinary, then they make it look easy. They make it look as though they've got time. Even against the dropper archers of this world, they seem to come out with that little extra time to spare. And that's all it is. It's a bit of sort of God-given grace. And again, I'm very grateful for it.
Right. And also, sir, I was asking Mr. Alvin Kalicharan too, do you think cricket in your times was a little difficult in the sense that no helmets, no restrictions on bouncers, maybe the gears that you used to wear were not of very good quality, uncovered pitches? I mean, you think it was a little difficult?
I think it's always difficult. I think it's always, it's a bit of a game we have to play to try and compare eras. But I think, I mean, the uncovered pitches wouldn't worry about too much. There was a little bit of that early in my career. There's some very strange things happened, actually. There were times, there was one year or two where they had, if it rained, you left the pitch uncovered, but covered the wicket ends and the run-up. So the bowlers could play, the batsmen couldn't, which seemed a bit strange. I mean, it allowed the game to carry on. Nowadays, of course, it's all almost, in a sense, too well protected. But I think the biggest problems we had, or personally I would suggest, were the four West Indies fast bowlers of the 80s, because they were the powerhouse of world cricket. Yes, I never liked, for instance, I never liked wearing a visor. They were available, but I found that sort of claustrophobic. I found having something here in front of me. I just never liked it. Nowadays, of course, people, they get used to it almost at birth. They play that's the way it feels. So I mean, they are obviously very comfortable with it, and it makes sense. Let's say this: it makes absolute sense to protect yourself as best you can. But I used to play with the helmets with little side pieces. So I felt as though if I made a bit of a mistake, at least I probably wouldn't die, but at least it might hurt a bit. And I have to say this: I tried once or twice being hit on the head without a helmet. It hurts a little bit more than it does when you have got a helmet. So it does make absolute sense. But we had bats that worked. I had some absolute brilliant bats now and again, made by mainly Gray Nichols. Then I went to a company called Open Championship at the end. And you know what it's like with bats; they vary. It's a bit of wood. It's not it's not made to measure as such. They do their best, and the bat manufacturers are extraordinary with their skills. I guess with modern bats, it might have the ball might have gone a little bit further, but I was never going to be Chris Gale. If you look at me. If I try and pump the arms up for you, I'm about a tenth of the size of Chris Gale here. And so I was always going to have to be touch. I was always going to have to be timing. Now and again, the ball would go for six, and I'd wonder how on earth it happened. But I was never going to muscle the ball miles. So actually, you didn't
even need to muscle the ball. You had such a great timing.
Well, thank you. I know, but that's what I had to remember. Sometimes. Do you know what? Sometimes I'll be watching, for instance, as a good example, Ian Botham, my great friend and colleague from the last 40 years. Ian is a different animal, and he could hit the ball with big bats a long, long way. And you sometimes at the other end to him, watching him do this, think, well, I must try that. But of course, we are very, very different as men, as players. And you have to remember, of course, that your own skill is your best skill. So every
Mm,
time I tried to hit the ball out of the park, it could get a bit ugly. And therefore I
mm,
had to try and remember just to do it my way, which, as we said earlier, by and large, seemed to work okay.
yeah. But like you mentioned, how do you think cricket has evolved in the last few years? I mean, maybe during your times, hitting the ball over the top was considered a sin, and now players are hitting the first ball in international cricket for a six.
Obviously in a T20, yeah, I mean
Yeah.
that's special. That is special. I suppose you have more scope to do that sort of thing in a T20 game.
Mm,
And if the but if the ball is there to hit, go for it. I mean that was what Surya Kumar Yadav, wasn't it, who just
yeah.
flicked it away.
Yeah.
I mean it's great to watch. I have to say it is fabulous to watch. And yes, okay, you know, boundary sizes are sometimes a bit different nowadays. Pitches, obviously, they vary up and down a bit. The bats are probably the biggest change that
Mm,
we've seen in the technicalities of the game, say in the last decade. But at the same time, I have huge respect for the people that play the game nowadays, because whatever equipment you're using, there is a golden rule. You still have to use it properly. And even
yeah.
with, you know, T20 boundaries and all the rest of it, you know,
Mm,
you make mistakes, you get out. So
yeah.
actually, it's still down to the skill of the players. And I have a huge sympathy for bowlers. I mean, the way bowling has evolved in the last, shall we say, decade, with the developments in especially T20, but ODI cricket. I mean, again, ODI cricket, when we played it, we played, what, 60 overs?
Yeah.
You know, 60 overs, and we got to 200. We thought we're doing okay. You know, I played a World Cup in '79 where it was those sort of figures, you know, 220, 230, and you thought, yeah, we're going to win that game.
Mm,
Nowadays, that's, you know, you're halfway there. But I think
mm,
it's brilliant to watch. It's
yeah.
awesome to watch. But that's the way the game has evolved
Yeah.
over the last 20, 30 years or so.
Yeah, that's right. Very nicely put forward by you. So, last question before we wind it up here. What advice do you want to give to the youngsters who want to play international cricket?
I always had one very strong piece of advice, which is to enjoy what you're doing, because
Yeah.
the moment it becomes, or the moment you lose the enjoyment, the fun, I think the game gets so much harder.
Yeah.
Yes, you can talk about the skills, you know, the simple skills, watching the ball at all times, batting, fielding, the whole thing, and the skills are always going to be important. But I think you have to have that mental toughness. Yes, you talked about that, but you have to have that sense that you're enjoying what you're doing, because the more you enjoy it, the better you get. The better you get,
Mhm.
the more you enjoy it, and you go
Yeah.
upwards and upwards, and that's how you make a long career. So as long as you can always keep a smile on your face, enjoy the good times, cope with the bad times, that's the way to carry on.
Mm, right. Zeal is very, very important. Mental toughness, like you mentioned, and obviously you need to enjoy your cricket. Thank you so much, Mr. David Gower. Brilliant answers that you gave. Thank you so much for giving us your precious time. It was fun chatting with you. Thank you.
My pleasure, and all the best to you all.